Hi there, welcome to Jayville Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. The town of Umwakwa was a vibrant and bustling place, known for its sprawling farmlands, colorful markets, and tightly knit community. Nestled in the wealthiest part of town stood the Johnson family's grand estate, a symbol of both affluence and hard-earned success. The compound was a sight to behold, a towering white mansion with golden gates, lush gardens blooming with hibiscus and frangipani, and a driveway paved with polished stones. It was a home that told a story of diligence, vision, and grace. Benjamin Johnson, the patriarch, was a man admired for his brilliance in business and his generosity in the community. Though his wealth set him apart, his humility kept him grounded. He had built his fortune through cocoa farming, expanding into trade and real estate over the years. Many envied his success, but most in the town respected him. His wife Elizabeth was his perfect complement. She was a woman of elegance and quiet strength, whose warm smile and kind words often melted even the coldest hearts. Their only child, Daniel, was the light of their lives, a cheerful boy with bright eyes and a boundless curiosity about the world. The Johnsons, however, valued privacy above all else. Though they were kind and generous, they rarely mingled with their neighbors. This sense of exclusivity added an air of mystery around their family. They often went on outings together, whether to the nearby hills for picnics or to the city for shopping sprees. These moments of joy, though ordinary to them, became a source of fascination and envy for others. One such neighbor was Martha Brown, a widow who lived in a modest bungalow adjacent to the Johnsons' estate. Martha's life had been one of hardship and disappointment. Her husband had died young, and years of childlessness had left her bitter and withdrawn. She often sat by her window watching the Johnsons' every move. She watched as Daniel played in the garden, his laughter echoing through the compound, and as Benjamin returned home with gifts that brought joy to his wife and son. Each moment of their happiness was like a dagger to Martha's heart. "Why them and not me?" she often muttered under her breath. Her resentment festered with every passing day. She envied Elizabeth's poise, Daniel's innocence, and Benjamin's success. At first it was subtle, a pang of longing here, a jealous thought there. But soon her envy consumed her entirely. It wasn't just the wealth she envied, it was the happiness, the love, and the completeness of the Johnson family that made her bitterness grow. While others in the town admired the Johnsons, Martha began to despise them. Every smile from Elizabeth felt like mockery. Every laugh from Daniel sounded like ridicule. She could no longer bear the sight of their joy. And so Martha began to scheme. She didn't know how, but she was determined to see their happiness destroyed. Her descent into darkness had begun. Martha Brown's bitterness began as a quiet murmur in her soul, a festering wound that refused to heal. Day by day, her resentment toward the Johnson family grew. Their happiness seemed to mock her pain. When Elizabeth laughed, Martha heard derision. When Daniel ran joyfully through the garden, Martha saw a taunt. Even Benjamin's friendly wave as he drove past her small bungalow filled her with rage. "Do they think they're better than me?" she whispered to herself one evening as she sat in her darkened living room. Her house, once a lively place when her husband was alive, now seemed like a prison. The air was heavy, the silence suffocating, and her loneliness unbearable. Martha's envy soon turned into an obsession. She began watching the Johnsons every day from her window, tracking their movements like a predator stalking prey. She took note of the days they left for their outings, the time Benjamin returned home from work, and the visitors they entertained. Her life revolved around their joy, and every moment of their happiness was like salt in her wounds. Martha's bitterness was fueled by her barrenness, a reality she had never come to terms with. After years of trying and failing to conceive, her husband had grown distant before his untimely death. She had no child to call her own, no one to carry on her name, and no one to love. Seeing Elizabeth and Daniel together felt like a cruel reminder of everything she had lost. In her despair, Martha began to isolate herself further from the community. She no longer attended church or visited the market. When neighbors came to check on her, she would shoo them away with curt words and a scowl. Her heart grew colder with each passing day, and soon her envy consumed her entirely. One day, while wandering through the outskirts of the town, Martha stumbled upon a small, dilapidated shrine hidden in the woods. It was a place she had heard of in whispers, a gathering spot for those seeking revenge, power, or forbidden knowledge. Desperation guided her steps as she approached the shrine, her heart pounding with fear and anticipation. Inside, the air was thick with incense and foreboding. A priest sat cross-legged on the floor, his face painted with eerie symbols. He looked up as Martha entered, his piercing gaze cutting through her. "What do you seek?" he asked, his voice low and menacing. Martha hesitated, her hands trembling. I want their happiness to end," she whispered. The priest nodded knowingly, as if he had heard such requests countless times before. He beckoned her closer, and she sat before him, her envy spilling out like a torrent. She described the Johnsons' joy, their wealth, their laughter, and how much she hated them for it. The priest listened silently before speaking. "Happiness built on envy is fleeting. Do you truly wish to bring ruin upon them?" "Yes," Martha said firmly, her voice steady for the first time. "They don't deserve what they have. Let them suffer as I have suffered." The priest handed her a small charm, its surface carved with symbols she couldn't understand. "This will bring calamity upon them. But remember, what you send out into the world often finds its way back." Martha dismissed the warning. She clutched the charm tightly, a wicked smile spreading across her face. "Let them try to laugh now," she muttered as she left the shrine, the weight of her envy transformed into a dark, vengeful purpose. Martha's return from the shrine marked the beginning of her descent into outright malevolence. She placed the charm in a box and tucked it under her bed, its sinister presence filling her with a dark sense of purpose. Each time she heard Daniel's laughter or saw Elizabeth's serene smile, she would mutter curses under her breath, her resolve to destroy their happiness growing stronger. The Johnsons, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing next door, continued their lives as usual. Benjamin worked hard, his business flourishing with each passing day. Elizabeth remained a picture of grace, managing the household and cherishing every moment with her son. Daniel, ever the curious and lively child, brought joy to all who encountered him. Their happiness became a thorn in Martha's heart, a constant reminder of everything she lacked. One evening, Martha sat by her window, watching as the Johnsons returned from one of their outings. Elizabeth stepped out of the car, her laughter ringing through the air as she held Daniel's hand. Benjamin followed, carrying bags filled with toys and treats. The sight was too much for Martha to bear. Her envy boiled over, and she slammed her window shut, her face contorted with rage. "It's time," she muttered to herself, her hands trembling as she retrieved the charm from under her bed. The next morning, Martha returned to the shrine, the charm in her hand and her heart filled with malice. The priest greeted her with a knowing look. "You have decided," he said, his voice low and foreboding. "Yes," Martha replied firmly. "I want their joy to end. I want them to feel the pain I have felt all these years." The priest nodded and took the charm from her. He placed it on a small altar, muttering incantations as he sprinkled it with a mixture of herbs and ashes. The air grew heavy and the room seemed to darken as the priest worked. When he finished, he handed the charm back to Martha. "This will bring them to ruin," he said, his tone grave. "But remember, what you sow, you shall also reap. Are you prepared for the consequences?" Martha dismissed his warning with a wave of her hand. "I don't care about consequences," she said. "I just want them gone." The priest said no more. Martha left the shrine, her steps steady and her heart cold. She returned home and placed the charm near her window, where it would face the Johnsons' house. She repeated the incantations the priest had taught her, her voice trembling with anger and anticipation. That night, as the Johnsons slept peacefully, the charm began its work. A strange wind blew through Martha's house, rattling her windows and filling her with a sense of power. She smiled to herself, convinced that her time of triumph was near. Unbeknownst to her, however, the forces she had unleashed would not only destroy the Johnsons' happiness, but also bring unimaginable suffering into her own life. The morning dawned bright and clear, the sun casting a golden glow over the Johnsons' estate. It was a Saturday, a day Benjamin always set aside for family outings. Elizabeth had packed a picnic basket with Daniel's favorite snacks, and the little boy was buzzing with excitement, running around the house as his mother tried to get him dressed. "Calm down, Daniel," Elizabeth said with a laugh, fastening the buttons on his shirt. "We're not going anywhere if you keep running away." Benjamin chuckled as he watched his wife chase after their son. "Let him enjoy himself, Lizzie. That's what today is about." By mid-morning, the family was ready. They loaded their car with a picnic basket, a blanket, and a few toys for Daniel to play with. Elizabeth settled into the passenger seat while Daniel climbed into the back, his small face pressed against the window as he waved to their neighbors. Benjamin started the car, and with a cheerful wave to their gatekeeper, they set off toward the countryside. Martha watched them from her window, a wicked smile on her lips. She had spent the entire night chanting over the charm, calling upon the spirits to bring disaster upon the Johnsons. As their car disappeared down the road, she whispered one last curse under her breath. Let this be their last journey. The Johnsons drove along the winding country roads, the air filled with laughter and Daniel's excited chatter. Benjamin kept one hand on the wheel and the other on Elizabeth's, their fingers intertwined. "I love these moments," Elizabeth said softly, her gaze fixed on her husband and son. "And I love you," Benjamin replied, his voice warm and steady. They were approaching a sharp bend in the road when it happened. A large truck appeared out of nowhere, barreling toward them at an uncontrollable speed. Benjamin's eyes widened in shock as he gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to swerve out of the way. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Elizabeth barely had time to scream before the truck collided with their car. The impact was catastrophic. Metal crunched against metal, glass shattered, and the car was hurled off the road, rolling down a small embankment before coming to a stop. When the dust settled, the scene was one of devastation. Benjamin's lifeless body was slumped over the steering wheel, his hands still gripping it tightly. Daniel lay motionless in the back seat, his small frame crushed under the weight of the debris. Elizabeth, thrown from the car, lay unconscious a few feet away, her body battered and broken. The accident cast a dark shadow over the town of Umuakwa, and the once cheerful Johnson home became a place of mourning. The news of Benjamin and Daniel's deaths spread quickly, plunging the community into grief. People spoke in hushed tones, their voices heavy with disbelief. How could such a loving and prosperous family be struck by such tragedy? Elizabeth was rushed to the town's general hospital, unconscious and barely clinging to life. Her body was covered in cuts and bruises, her ribs broken and her face pale and lifeless. For 2 days she remained in a coma, unaware that her beloved husband and son were gone. The doctors worked tirelessly, but they could not bring themselves to tell her the devastating truth once she woke. Back in the Johnson mansion, the gatekeeper, household staff, and neighbors gathered to mourn. Benjamin's employees, who respected him deeply, came to pay their respects. Some brought food for the grieving household, while others lit candles outside the gate, praying for Elizabeth's recovery. Meanwhile, Martha stayed in her home, peeking through her window at the mourners. She felt no sympathy, no remorse, only a twisted sense of satisfaction. "Now she knows what it feels like to lose everything," Martha muttered to herself, her voice cold and devoid of emotion. But not everyone believed the accident was purely coincidental. Some neighbors whispered about Martha's strange behavior in recent weeks. "She's been acting differently," one woman said to another, "always muttering to herself and avoiding people." "She's never liked the Johnsons," another replied. "Do you think she had something to do with this?" These suspicions grew, though no one dared confront Martha directly. Her reclusive nature and the eerie atmosphere surrounding her home made her a figure of fear and speculation. When Elizabeth finally regained consciousness, she was met with the gentle but sorrowful face of her doctor. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, his voice trembling, "there's something you need to know." The words that followed shattered Elizabeth's world. Her screams echoed through the hospital halls as she learned of Benjamin and Daniel's deaths. The loss was unbearable, a pain so profound it felt as if her heart were being torn from her chest. "No," she wailed, tears streaming down her face. "This can't be true, Benjamin." "My Daniel, no." The nurses tried to comfort her, but her anguish was inconsolable. She collapsed into sobs, clutching at the hospital sheets as if trying to hold on to the fragments of her broken life. For days, Elizabeth refused food and water, her body weakened by grief. Her mind replayed the moments before the accident, the warmth of Benjamin's hand in hers, Daniel's laughter ringing in her ears. Now those memories felt like cruel taunts, reminders of what she had lost. Back in her home, the staff cleared out Benjamin and Daniel's belongings, each item a painful reminder of the family they had once served. Elizabeth, now confined to her bed, could hear the faint sound of their footsteps and the clinking of objects being packed away. Each sound was like a knife to her heart. As the days turned into weeks, Elizabeth's sorrow deepened. She avoided visitors, locked herself in her room, and stared at the ceiling for hours. The once vibrant and joyful woman was now a shadow of her former self. And yet, despite her suffering, the weight of Martha's hatred did not lift. She continued to gloat in her home, convinced that she had triumphed. But even as she reveled in her perceived victory, an ominous unease began to creep into her life, a shadow of the consequences that were yet to come. Weeks passed, but the wound in Elizabeth's heart refused to heal. Every corner of her once vibrant home reminded her of the life she had lost. The laughter of her son and the comforting presence of her husband haunted her, echoing in the silence that now consumed the mansion. She no longer walked through the gardens they had loved or sat at dining table where they had shared so many meals. Instead, she remained confined to her room, her grief a weight that seemed impossible to bear. Though the community mourned alongside her, whispers of suspicion about Martha grew louder. "She didn't even show up at the funeral," a neighbor remarked, "not even to offer her condolences. It's strange, don't you think?" Martha, however, remained defiant in her home. She reveled in Elizabeth's suffering, convinced that her curse had achieved its purpose. Each day she would sit by her window, watching as mourners trickled in and out of the Johnson mansion. Her lips would curl into a cruel smile, satisfaction radiating from her eyes. "She'll never recover," Martha muttered one evening as she clutched the charm tightly. "Her happiness is gone, just like mine was. Now she'll know what it feels like to be hollow." But the spirits Martha had summoned were not done. Their thirst for destruction had not been fully quenched. As the weeks turned into months, Elizabeth found herself plagued by a mysterious affliction. One morning, as she attempted to get out of bed, she felt an inexplicable weakness in her legs. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled beneath her and she collapsed onto the floor. Panic gripped her as she cried out for help. The household staff rushed to her aid, but no amount of coaxing could get her to stand. Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, where doctors conducted tests and scans, only to find nothing physically wrong. "It's as if her body has forgotten how to walk," one doctor explained, puzzled. "There's no medical reason for this." Elizabeth's condition baffled everyone, but in her heart she knew this was no ordinary ailment. The weight of the spiritual world seemed to press down on her, and she felt the darkness of something unseen creeping into her life. Martha, hearing of Elizabeth's paralysis, felt a dark satisfaction unlike anything she had ever experienced. "Good," she sneered. "Let her suffer even more." Her bitterness knew no bounds. To ensure Elizabeth remained confined to her misery, Martha returned to the shrine. She must never walk again, Martha demanded of the priest. "I want her trapped, unable to move, unable to heal." The priest, though wary, granted her request. Another charm was prepared, this time sealing Elizabeth's fate in the physical world. "You have gone too far," he warned. "The spirits may turn against you." "I don't care," Martha replied, her voice icy. "She deserves every bit of this." Meanwhile, Elizabeth's despair deepened. Confined to a wheelchair, her world seemed to shrink with each passing day. The woman who had once radiated grace and strength now felt like a prisoner in her own body. She avoided mirrors, unable to bear the sight of her own broken reflection. But as she lay in her room, staring at the ceiling, she began to feel the faintest flicker of something she had nearly lost: hope. Somewhere deep within her soul, a voice whispered, "This is not the end." Unbeknownst to her, the forces of light had begun to stir, preparing for a battle that would not only free her from her suffering, but also bring Martha's wickedness to an end. Martha's cruel triumph over Elizabeth's plight was short-lived. Though she believed she had finally exacted her revenge, strange occurrences began to unsettle her. At first they were small, almost unnoticeable. Shadows seemed to flicker in her peripheral vision, and the sound of whispers filled her home at night. She dismissed them as figments of her imagination, chalking them up to sleepless nights. But the shadows grew darker, the whispers louder. She could no longer sit alone in her home without feeling a cold presence nearby. Her once confident demeanor began to crumble, replaced by unease and paranoia. She avoided her neighbors entirely, locking herself inside and drawing the curtains tightly. The weight of her actions pressed down on her like a heavy shroud. One night, as Martha prepared to sleep, the charm she had placed under her bed began to glow faintly. She stared at it in horror as it emitted a strange low hum. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing her lamp and plunging her into darkness. A voice, deep and guttural, echoed through the space. "You have taken more than you should," it growled. Martha screamed, clutching her ears and falling to the floor. The room grew colder and she could feel unseen hands gripping her tightly. The presence left as quickly as it had come, but the warning was clear. She had set forces in motion that she could no longer control. The next morning, Martha woke with a dull ache in her legs. She struggled to rise from her bed, but her knees buckled, sending her crashing to the floor. Panic surged through her as she crawled to a chair, using it to pull herself up. Her legs felt heavy and unresponsive, as though they no longer belonged to her. "Not me," she whispered, fear lacing her voice. "This can't happen to me." She stumbled to the shrine, her legs trembling with every step. When she arrived, the priest greeted her with a somber expression. "The spirits are restless," he said. "They are angry with your greed and cruelty. You have disturbed the balance." Martha fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Fix it," she begged. "I will do anything to appease them." The priest shook his head. "You have gone too far. The spirits demand justice. What you have done to Elizabeth is now coming back to you." Martha's pleas fell on deaf ears. She returned home defeated, her legs growing weaker with each passing day. Soon she was confined to a wheelchair, her once proud strides reduced to being pushed around by reluctant neighbors. Her isolation deepened, and the whispers of the community grew louder. She brought this on herself, people said. She meddled with things she didn't understand. For Martha, the torment was not just physical but spiritual. Her nights were plagued by nightmares of the Johnson family. She saw Benjamin and Daniel standing before her, their eyes hollow and accusing. She heard Elizabeth's cries of anguish echoing in her ears. The guilt she had tried to bury began to rise to the surface, consuming her entirely. Martha's once spiteful confidence gave way to fear and regret. Her body, now frail and broken, mirrored the emptiness of her soul. She was a prisoner of her own wickedness, trapped in a torment she could not escape. While Martha spiraled into torment, Elizabeth continued to endure her suffering in silence. Her once lively and vibrant home had become a place of sorrow, a shadow of its former self. Though confined to her wheelchair, Elizabeth tried to maintain what little dignity she had left. The pain of losing her husband and son was still raw, and the added burden of her mysterious paralysis weighed heavily on her spirit. Her household staff, though loyal, could not ease the ache in her heart. They prayed for her recovery and tried their best to bring some light into her darkened world, but Elizabeth remained distant. Most days she sat by the window, staring out into the garden that Benjamin and Daniel had once tended together. The sight of their favorite flowers, now wilting from neglect, brought fresh tears to her eyes. The community, though sympathetic, began to move on with their lives. Only a few neighbors visited now, bringing food or offering prayers. Elizabeth accepted their kindness but remained emotionally distant, retreating further into herself. One Sunday afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived at Elizabeth's home. Reverend Peter, a traveling preacher known for his fervent prayers and spiritual insight, had heard of her plight during his visit to Umuakwa. The Johnson tragedy had reached far beyond the town, and stories of Elizabeth's grief and paralysis had touched many hearts. Reverend Peter was a tall, soft-spoken man with an air of quiet authority. He was known for his compassion and unwavering faith, and his presence immediately filled the room with a sense of peace. Elizabeth, who had not seen visitors for weeks, allowed him to enter, though she was skeptical of what he could do for her. "Mrs. Johnson," Reverend Peter began gently, "I have heard of your sorrow, and I have come to pray for you. But more importantly, I have come to seek the truth about what has been done to you." Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. Reverend Peter sat beside her and held her hand, his grip firm yet comforting. "You have been under attack, my sister," he continued, his voice steady. "This is not just grief or misfortune, it is a spiritual battle. Someone has sought to destroy you, and their wickedness has taken root in your life." Elizabeth's lips quivered as she finally spoke. "What can I do? I've lost everything. My husband, my son, I can't even walk. I feel like I'm cursed." Reverend Peter's eyes softened with compassion. "You are not cursed, Elizabeth, but there is evil at work here, and it must be broken. Do you trust in the power of God?" Elizabeth nodded weakly, though her faith had been shaken by her ordeal. Reverend Peter knelt beside her, his hands outstretched, and began to pray with fervor. "Father, in the name of Jesus, I rebuke every power of darkness that has taken hold of this home. I declare that no weapon formed against this family shall prosper. Let every chain of wickedness be broken, and let your light shine in this darkness." As he prayed, Elizabeth felt a warmth spread through her body, a sensation she had not experienced in years. Her heart, heavy with grief, began to feel lighter, as though a burden was being lifted. Tears streamed down her face as Reverend Peter continued to pray, his voice unwavering. The staff, drawn by the sound of his powerful prayers, gathered outside the room, their heads bowed in reverence. The atmosphere in the house shifted, as if a veil of despair had been lifted. For the first time in years, hope began to flicker in Elizabeth's heart. While Reverend Peter's prayers began to bring light into Elizabeth's life, Martha's descent into darkness became even more unbearable. Confined to her wheelchair, her health deteriorated rapidly. She was plagued by an unrelenting pain in her body, and her nights were filled with horrifying visions. Shadows crept across her walls, whispering in tongues she couldn't understand. Her sleep was broken by the ghostly cries of Benjamin and Daniel, their hollow voices accusing her of her crimes. At first, Martha tried to dismiss these occurrences as bad dreams or her imagination. But the torment was relentless. Her once lively home had become a prison of dread. The air inside was heavy, suffocating, as if the spirits of her wicked deeds lingered, watching her every move. Her neighbors noticed the change. Martha, who once exuded spiteful confidence, now looked like a shell of her former self, frail, gaunt, and consumed by fear. "She's not the same," one neighbor whispered to another. "It's as if something is haunting her." "Do you think it's connected to the Johnsons?" another replied, voicing what many had started to suspect, but were too afraid to say outright. Martha, however, still refused to admit her guilt. She clung to her pride, convinced she could outsmart the forces she had summoned. But the darkness surrounding her grew heavier with each passing day. One night, as she sat alone in her dimly lit living room, the charm she had once used against Elizabeth began to glow faintly on the shelf where she had placed it. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing her lamp. The shadows in the corners of the room grew larger, merging into a single, ominous figure. Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat as the figure moved closer. Its form was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes burned with an otherworldly fire. "You have unleashed us," the figure growled, its voice low and menacing. "And now we shall consume you." Martha screamed, clawing at her wheelchair as she tried to move away, but her legs were useless. The figure loomed over her, its presence suffocating. "No, leave me alone," she cried, her voice trembling with terror. But the figure did not leave. Instead, it whispered a chilling warning. "What you have done will be your undoing. The suffering you inflicted shall return to you tenfold." The next morning, Martha woke drenched in sweat, her body trembling. The experience had left her weaker than ever. Her legs, which had already been failing her, now refused to move entirely. She was paralyzed from the waist down, completely dependent on her neighbors for help. Desperate, Martha tried to return to the shrine, but her condition made the journey impossible. She sent word to the priest, begging him to come to her home. When he arrived, his expression was grim. "You were warned," he said, his voice laced with disappointment. "You were told not to let envy consume you. The spirits have turned against you, and they will not be appeased." "Please," Martha begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do anything to fix this, just make it stop." But the priest shook his head. "The spirits demand justice. You cannot escape the consequences of your actions." Defeated, Martha slumped in her wheelchair, her face buried in her hands. For the first time, she began to feel the weight of her guilt. She had destroyed an innocent family out of envy, and now she was paying the price. As the days turned into weeks, Martha's torment deepened. The visions became more frequent, the shadows more menacing. Her once proud home, where she had gloated over Elizabeth's suffering, was now a place of fear and despair. She could no longer sleep, eat, or think clearly. And yet, even as she suffered, she refused to admit her wrongs to anyone. Her pride, though battered, still clung to her like a shroud, preventing her from seeking true repentance. But deep within her heart, a seed of regret began to grow, a small, fragile hope that she might one day be freed from the darkness she had unleashed. Elizabeth sat in her wheelchair, gazing out at the once vibrant garden that now lay in disarray. It was a perfect reflection of her life, broken, neglected, and filled with sorrow. She longed for the days when Daniel's laughter filled the air and Benjamin's reassuring voice calmed her worries. But those days were gone, replaced by an unrelenting darkness she couldn't escape. Reverend Peter visited her regularly, bringing with him a steady presence of faith and hope. He would pray over her, read scriptures, and speak of restoration. At first, Elizabeth was skeptical. What could prayer do against the weight of such pain? But with each visit, her hardened heart began to soften, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a glimmer of hope. One afternoon, as Reverend Peter knelt beside her, he paused in his prayer and looked deeply into her eyes. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low but firm, "I feel a powerful evil at work here. This paralysis, this sorrow, it is not just the result of an accident or grief. There is a curse on your life, and it must be broken." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much but had been too afraid to voice it. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I mean someone has deliberately sought to destroy you," Reverend Peter replied. "This is not the will of God, but His power is greater than any darkness, and I believe He can restore you." Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I have the strength to believe anymore, but if you think there's hope, then I'll try." That evening, Reverend Peter gathered Elizabeth's household staff and a few trusted neighbors for a prayer session. Together, they prayed fervently, their voices rising like a mighty chorus. The atmosphere in the house began to shift as if a heavy weight was being lifted. Elizabeth, though still in her wheelchair, felt a strange warmth spreading through her body. It started in her chest, radiating outward to her arms and legs. She gasped, clutching the arms of her chair as the sensation grew stronger. "Do you feel that?" Reverend Peter asked, his eyes lighting up with determination. Elizabeth nodded, her tears flowing freely. Yes, I do." "This is the power of God being the chains that have bound you," Reverend Peter declared. "Keep praying, keep believing." Meanwhile, in her own darkened home, Martha felt the repercussions of their prayers. As the light began to enter Elizabeth's life, the shadows in Martha's world grew darker and more oppressive. Her body, already weakened by paralysis, began to shake uncontrollably. She clutched at her chest, gasping for air as a cold presence enveloped her. "No," she cried out into the empty room. "I won't let her win." But the spirits Martha had unleashed were no longer under her control. They turned on her with ferocity, feeding on her fear and despair. The charm she had used to curse Elizabeth began to emit a low hum, its surface cracking as if it were breaking under the weight of the prayers being offered on Elizabeth's behalf. By the time the prayer session ended, Elizabeth felt lighter than she had in years. Though she was still unable to walk, her spirit had been renewed. She looked at Reverend Peter, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "For the first time, I feel like I might be able to move forward." "This is only the beginning," Reverend Peter replied. "There is more work to be done, but I believe the breakthrough is near." For the first time since the accident, Elizabeth allowed herself to hope for healing, for restoration, and for the light to finally overcome the darkness that had overshadowed her life. Elizabeth sat in her wheelchair, gazing out at the once vibrant garden that now lay in disarray. It was a perfect reflection of her life, broken, neglected, and filled with sorrow. She longed for the days when Daniel's laughter filled the air and Benjamin's reassuring voice calmed her worries. But those days were gone, replaced by an unrelenting darkness she couldn't escape. Reverend Peter visited her regularly, bringing with him a steady presence of faith and hope. He would pray over her, read scriptures, and speak of restoration. At first, Elizabeth was skeptical. What could prayer do against the weight of such pain? But with each visit, her hardened heart began to soften, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a glimmer of hope. One afternoon, as Reverend Peter knelt beside her, he paused in his prayer and looked deeply into her eyes. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice low but firm, "I feel a powerful evil at work here. This paralysis, this sorrow, it is not just the result of an accident or grief. There is a curse on your life and it must be broken." Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much but had been too afraid to voice it. "What do you mean?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I mean someone has deliberately sought to destroy you," Reverend Peter replied. "This is not the will of God, but His power is greater than any darkness, and I believe He can restore you." Elizabeth nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know if I have the strength to believe anymore, but if you think there's hope, then I'll try." That evening, Reverend Peter gathered Elizabeth's household staff and a few trusted neighbors for a prayer session. Together, they prayed fervently, their voices rising like a mighty chorus. The atmosphere in the house began to shift, as if a heavy weight was being lifted. Elizabeth, though still in her wheelchair, felt a strange warmth spreading through her body. It started in her chest, radiating outward to her arms and legs. She gasped, clutching the arms of her chair as the sensation grew stronger. "Do you feel that?" Reverend Peter asked, his eyes lighting up with determination. Elizabeth nodded, her tears flowing freely. Yes, I do. This is the power of God breaking the chains that have bound you," Reverend Peter declared. "Keep praying, keep believing." Meanwhile, in her own darkened home, Martha felt the repercussions of their prayers. As the light began to enter Elizabeth's life, the shadows in Martha's world grew darker and more oppressive. Her body, already weakened by paralysis, began to shake uncontrollably. She clutched at her chest, gasping for air as a cold presence enveloped her. "No," she cried out into the empty room. "I won't let her win." But the spirits Martha had unleashed were no longer under her control. They turned on her with ferocity, feeding on her fear and despair. The charm she had used to curse Elizabeth began to emit a low hum, its surface cracking as if it were breaking under the weight of the prayers being offered on Elizabeth's behalf. By the time the prayer session ended, Elizabeth felt lighter than she had in years. Though she was still unable to walk, her spirit had been renewed. She looked at Reverend Peter, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "For the first time, I feel like I might be able to move forward." "This is only the beginning," Reverend Peter replied. "There is more work to be done, but I believe the breakthrough is near." For the first time since the accident, Elizabeth allowed herself to hope for healing, for restoration, and for the light to finally overcome the darkness that had overshadowed her life. The news of Martha's death swept through the town of Umwakwa like wildfire. The neighbors, though startled by the suddenness of her passing, whispered among themselves about the strange occurrences that had plagued her life in recent months. Many believed her death was divine retribution, a consequence of her envy and the wickedness she had unleashed. "She brought this on herself," one neighbor muttered. "Her hatred consumed her, and now she's paid the ultimate price," another added. Inside the Johnson home, the atmosphere was one of solemn reflection. Elizabeth, now able to walk with effort, sat quietly in the garden for the first time since the accident. The flowers Benjamin and Daniel had once tended seemed to bloom brighter, as if rejoicing in her newfound strength. Reverend Peter sat beside her, his Bible open in his lap. "God's justice always prevails," he said gently. Martha's actions were born out of envy and bitterness, but her choices led to her downfall. You, Elizabeth, are living proof of God's mercy and restoration. Elizabeth nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Though she felt no hatred toward Martha, she couldn't help but mourn the waste of a life consumed by darkness. "I wish she had chosen differently," she said softly. "Maybe things could have been different for all of us." Reverend Peter smiled sadly. "Envy is a powerful poison, Elizabeth. It blinds people to the blessings in their own lives and makes them covet what others have. But your story is a testament to resilience and faith. You survived, and now you have a chance to build something new." Martha's funeral was a somber affair. Few people attended, and even those who came did so out of obligation rather than love. The priest from the shrine, his face weary and lined with regret, performed the final rites. "She was consumed by her own hatred," he said quietly as her coffin was lowered into the ground. "And in the end, it destroyed her." The neighbors stood at a distance, watching in silence. No one spoke of her good deeds because there were none to recall. Instead, her life became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked envy and bitterness. As the burial concluded, the community slowly dispersed, their whispers fading into the wind. The shadow that Martha had cast over the Johnson family's life was finally gone. In the days following Martha's death, Elizabeth began to rebuild her life. Though the scars of her loss remained, she found strength in her faith and the support of those around her. She spent more time in the garden, tending to the flowers Daniel had loved and planting new ones in Benjamin's memory. Her home, once a place of grief, began to fill with light again. She welcomed visitors, neighbors, and children, offering them the warmth and kindness that had always defined her. One afternoon, as she walked through the market, she came across a group of orphans begging for food. The sight of their thin, desperate faces stirred something deep within her. She approached them, offering what little she had in her bag. From that moment on, Elizabeth's mission became clear. She used her wealth to open a small orphanage, providing a home and education for children who had no one else. The community rallied around her, donating food, clothes, and time to support her efforts. Elizabeth's story became a beacon of hope for the people of Umuakwa. Her resilience in the face of unimaginable loss inspired others to rise above their struggles. The memory of Benjamin and Daniel lived on through her work, their love and joy reflected in the lives of the children she cared for. Reverend Peter continued to visit regularly, offering guidance and prayer. "You've turned your pain into purpose," he said during one of his visits. "That is the greatest triumph of all." Elizabeth smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Though she still missed her husband and son deeply, she found peace in knowing that their legacy would endure. Though Martha was gone, her story lingered in the minds of the community. Parents warned their children of the dangers of envy, using her life as an example of what hatred could do. Her once proud home remained abandoned, a stark reminder of her choices and their consequences. But Elizabeth refused to dwell on Martha's downfall. Instead, she chose to focus on forgiveness and healing. She was a victim of her own bitterness, Elizabeth said when asked about her former neighbor. "I only wish she had found peace before it was too late." Elizabeth's days grew busier as her orphanage began to thrive. Children filled the once silent halls of her home with laughter and chatter, a sound that brought life back to her spirit. Each child she took in became a symbol of her healing, a way to channel her grief into something meaningful. She dedicated herself to teaching the children, helping them grow in confidence and knowledge. Her once private life became one of service and openness. The community marveled at her strength and transformation. The woman who had once been broken now stood tall, her smile a testament to her resilience. Reverend Peter continued to guide her spiritually. On one of his visits, as they walked through the garden, he remarked, "This is what true faith does, Elizabeth. It turns ashes into beauty, mourning into joy. You've shown this entire town that hope can bloom even in the darkest of times. Elizabeth paused and looked up at the sky. The sun was shining brightly, its warmth filling her with a quiet peace. I couldn't have done it without God's grace, she said softly. Or your prayers, Reverend. The town of Umwakwa also began to rally behind her efforts. Farmers donated fresh produce for the children, artisans provided clothing, and volunteers came to help teach and care for the orphans. Elizabeth's home, once a place of grief and silence, became a beacon of hope for the less fortunate. Martha's house, now abandoned and overgrown with weeds, stood as a grim reminder of the price of envy. No one dared to live there, fearing the dark spirits that were said to linger. Children would dare each other to run up to the gate, only to run back screaming in fear of the eerie atmosphere. Yet, for Elizabeth, Martha's story held a different meaning. She often told it to the children in her care as a lesson about forgiveness, faith, and the consequences of bitterness. Martha made a mistake, she would say gently, but we must learn from it. Don't let envy take root in your heart. Be content with what you have and celebrate the blessings of others. The children listened intently, nodding as they absorbed her words. One day, a young girl in the orphanage asked, "Do you forgive her, Mrs. Johnson?" Elizabeth's eyes softened and she knelt to the girl's level. "Yes, my dear, I forgave her long ago. Holding on to anger or hatred would only hurt me more. Forgiveness is how we heal." Her answer became a powerful lesson for the children, shaping their outlook on life. Many of them, despite their difficult circumstances, began to approach the world with a sense of gratitude and kindness. Years passed and Elizabeth's orphanage grew into a respected institution in the region. What had started as a small act of compassion blossomed into a legacy that touched countless lives. The children she cared for grew up, many of them returning as adults to thank her for the love and guidance she had given them. One such child, a boy named Samuel, approached Elizabeth one evening as the sun set over the garden. "Mama Lizzie," he said, using the affectionate name the children called her. "I've been thinking about what you taught us about forgiveness. It's because of you that I've been able to let go of my anger and find peace." Elizabeth smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "That means more to me than you'll ever know, Samuel. Your happiness is my greatest reward." Meanwhile, Reverend Peter, now an elderly man, visited Elizabeth one last time. "My work here is done," he said with a kind smile. "You've turned this tragedy into a testimony of God's grace. The light in this home will shine for generations." Elizabeth embraced him, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." That night, as Elizabeth sat in her garden, she looked up at the stars and whispered a prayer of thanks. She thought of Benjamin and Daniel, imagining their smiles as they watched over her. Their love had not ended with their deaths, it had transformed, guiding her to build a life filled with purpose and hope. The once wealthy woman who had lived a private, exclusive life had become a cornerstone of her community, her story of pain and triumph inspiring all who knew her. As the children's laughter filled the air, Elizabeth closed her eyes, her heart finally at peace. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.